So I'm just going to make a few, well, no, I'm going to tell a couple stories, and then I'm going to invite you all to have me post an invitation to come to the report back that we're also doing with 3 people, myself, Cindy Folkers of Beyond Nuclear, and my co-author, Amanda Nichols, for this report. And I'm going to talk broadly, and then I'll come specifically to this report in these couple stories I'm going to tell. So the first thing is, I forget that the United Nations was founded months after the nuclear destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was founded in 1945. I don't know if it was September or October, but you know, the bombs were dropped in August. And the world came together and founded the United Nations in the wake of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So as we go into the 2025 anniversaries, which always sort of bug me because we have the mandate to not forget. So it is so important that we teach and remember what happened. And at the same time, these are not celebrations. What we can celebrate, however, is the anniversary of the UN founding, which our community has never really embraced. And I'm not saying we should do anything, I'm just pointing out that really a pillar of change on planet Earth is these nations coming together. Whether they do it well or not is a different question. So just merely the founding of the UN 80 years ago is something that I'm really shifting my own thoughts about. So going to the UN, always for me hallowed ground, because when I was a little kid, my mother was deeply devoted to the United Nations. And if my sister and I were fighting, she'd make us decide what countries we were. And then we'd sit down at a table and we would represent, of course, our own conflicts, but as those countries. And I wish she'd understood conflict negotiation better. I might be a better negotiator today. But in any case, the whole notion of going to the UN, I haven't counted it up, but this must have been the 10th or roughly around the 10th time I spoke inside the United Nations. And this time it was with the 3rd meeting of the countries that have become parties to the new treaty that is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So most of our adult lives as people engaged on nuclear, the treaty that we have focused on is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was formed in the late 1960s, came into force in the early 1970s, and is there today. As a matter of fact, this year, next month, is a review conference for the NPT. And it continues to be administered as a military treaty under the UN Security Council. And of course, this is down in the weeds, but most people think that maybe the Security Council is above the General Assembly, or maybe it's an arm of the General Assembly. But no, back 80 years ago, a bicameral body was formed, and the 2 bodies were formed side by side. So the Security Council administers the military code of the international law, and the General Assembly administers the humanitarian code of international law. And the reason this is so important is that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is the first non-military treaty on nuclear weapons. It's a humanitarian treaty, which took it into the sphere of the General Assembly to be written, negotiated, and voted on. In the Security Council, each nation that is a permanent member that has nuclear weapons also has a veto. And any one of them can block any initiative inside the Security Council. That does not translate over to the General Assembly. And the General Assembly, there's 193 nations in the UN. Each of them has 1 vote, regardless of their size. And there is no vetoes inside the General Assembly. So to ever get any kind of change on nuclear, which was not occurring from 1970 into the era of 2010, the idea was, let's make a humanitarian treaty. So over in the world of skeptics, it's become hard to dismiss this action by the United Nations now that there are 93 nations that have signed. and 74 nations that have ratified. And when you ratify, you become the actual party. So I went to the third meeting of the parties to the treaty. And it's a very vibrant session because it's forward-looking and it's exciting because it's about helping people. And it's attracting younger people, so it's not just people like us in this room who were there. There are people in their late teens, college-age people, bringing forward proposals and presenting papers. And so it was really uplifting to me to be there, and now comes the bragging part, and then I'll stop and let us discuss and take questions. So 2 years ago, roughly, I was approached by a UN independent institute called the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR. They had put out a call for papers, and I didn't even know about it. And so I was contacted and said, "You didn't apply." And I said, "Well, I didn't even know about it." And they essentially worked with me and invited me to do an update on the disproportionate harm from ionizing radiation to female bodies compared to male bodies. I had been a speaker in 2014 at the third conference before the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was written and adopted. I was actually the opening speaker. I have had a very large portion of the airtime on this treaty because of how important it is to the meeting of the humanitarian template, if you will. The humanitarian law focuses on non-combatants, on disproportionate impacts to children, to women, to elders. Through time is another feature. So one of the main treaties that embodies this is the one on mines, which we are all just grieving the fact that nations are beginning to pull out of the mine treaty, which was the most successful treaty ever. Like only 2 nations in the world didn't sign it, our own and Singapore. And now because of the destabilization in Europe, there's European nations who are pulling out of the mines, the Convention on Mines as it's called. But that was the template for bringing nuclear weapons in. And nuclear weapons are so indiscriminate. We know this. You press the button, the world goes boom, there's nuclear winter. All of the stuff that Ira and his crowd have documented and figured out about famine and all those things, yes. But where can you show those disproportionate impacts? And it happens that my own work is tied to the moment of detonation of a weapon. It's not the fallout that I'm looking at when I talk about disproportionate impacts. It's actually that gamma and neutron burst that's been the basis of the study of the lifespan study of A-bomb survivors is tied to that instantaneous exposure. That's the one that everybody in the study got. So tying it to the weapon itself was key. And then the rest is pretty obvious. I found that children are harmed more than adults. Females are harmed more than males. That makes young females the most harmed. And that message was delivered by me in pictures. You didn't have to know English. You did not need to do math. You didn't have to understand large statistical analyses to get it. So yay, but now I've been giving that same talk since 2014. They wanted an update. And so I said no. I said I'm partly retired. I don't have a staff. I don't have access to the journals. No. So they came back and they asked me again. I said no again. And then all of a sudden a little light bulb went on that I knew Amanda Nichols, who is a postdoc at University of California, Santa Barbara. She did her thesis getting her PhD on 5 women leaders of the anti-nuclear movement in the United States. I was one of those leaders that she profiled. I stayed in touch with Amanda because mentoring is something I strongly believe in. And so all of a sudden a little light went on. I said, wait a minute, I'll go ask somebody if they'll be my co-author. If they say yes, I'll say yes. So I approached Amanda. She was overjoyed. She thought it was a fabulous opportunity to write a UN report. Yay. And so we took almost a year and a half to get this thing done. But the significance of this report and why we went to the UN to deliver this new message is that the first work I did was based on a huge report published by the US National Academy of Science. So my source of data was for the average person and expert in the US and around the world, unimpeachable, because it was from Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation, number 7, year 7, National Academy of Sciences, 2006. That was it. That's the only thing I looked at. But they looked at bazillions of things to publish the data they published. So we, me and Amanda, did a survey based on a protocol of a subset of the literature that's been published since then. And so in 2022, when I presented this stuff the last time at the UN in Vienna, we had one big fat source from the National Academy of Science. We found 19 more, where there's research that's been published in peer-reviewed literature that shows in the data that they are presenting that female bodies are harmed more than males, and in a subset of those, that it's tied to age as well, that younger people are harmed more when they're exposed than older people are harmed when they're exposed. And then finally, we are now able to broaden it out. The initial findings were solely on cancer, solid tumors, and now we show the same effects in the literature being published since 2006 on heart attack, stroke, cardiovascular disease in general, and indications on other types of endocrine-based disorders and that kind of thing. So it's looking like it's across the boards, female bodies in every regard are more harmed by radiation than our male bodies. And we're able now in published research to say that there's dose-related outcomes for these other illnesses tied to radiation, not only cancer. So yeah, we did this publication in November. We took it just last month in March to the UN, and now it's incumbent upon us to figure out how to get it out more widely. So I invite everyone to think about that, and I will send around, because I failed to put it, did I fail to put it in that little handout? I think I did. The link to the report online, because I only brought the last 2 copies of paper here. I'm sorry, I don't have one for everybody.
I have a question. Earlier you said the data you were using, the one source, was from the weapon and not from fallout.
Yes.
So my question is, what is the radiation of those studies from? Is it from medical radiation or weapons or fallout or?
All of the above. We simply went into the literature. Again, we can't look at all the literature. That's beyond our capacity. So we created a protocol for what part of literature we were looking at. So like, we didn't want to look at any animal studies. Other people would, we didn't. We didn't want to look at any non-terrestrial sources of radiation. You could, but we chose not to. So there's this protocol that we published for how we sifted the literature. And we also had certain sources that we were looking at in the digitized results, which journals. So the long and the short is that we then organized the 49 papers that we analyzed into continued lifespan studies, which the lifespan has not been well understood, but it is tied to the detonation point. That's what that source of radiation exposure is taken as, and all other sources of radiation in the lives of the survivors is assumed to be random. So that the signal is that first exposure in 1945. The noise is everything else. So that's not well understood, but that's the case with lifespan, and then they continue to publish additional studies from that. So some of what we are bringing in here are additional analyses of that data. But yes, then there's medical, then there's a situation that happened where a building in China was built out of radioactive stuff and people have been living in it, and there's been papers published about that. There's no actual expressly fallout study that we could find, so we're just reporting that if you go out and stick your little shovel in and then sift it in your little screen, you can find 19 more examples that female bodies are harmed more. That's it. You can't do a meta-analysis. You can't say it's more or less from this source or that source. But now the ice is not thin. The ice
Fabulous
is thick.
research. Thank you.
You're
Yes.
welcome. Oh, and I should brag for just another moment. We had 4 ambassadors. It was so exciting. You go in the UN, you get a room, and you have somebody who's holding the meeting. And we had the guy who's the head of the whole meeting is from Kazakhstan, which is a nation that's been very impacted by nuclear weapons testing of the USSR. And he was a speaker with us. And then we had discussants that included the ambassador from Mexico and Alexander Kment, who was the one who originally invited me to get into all this, from Austria. And then the final comments were from the ambassador from Ireland. And it was this UNIDIR that moderated. So, you know, it's like, really, here I am. I wrote a UN report, guys. Here it is.
I read a lot of it online. It's a great report. It's available online, as you know.
It is.
Yeah.
You can just, if you just put in gender and ionizing radiation in my name, you'll get my website and this. So, but I'll send it on an email to everybody later today, the link to the report.
The link to the book.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mary, I have long felt that I'm the wrong messenger. And so part of my work has been trying to find the right messengers, because this needs to come from the medical community. It needs to come from the scientific community. And so more and more of my time at a podium is devoted to calling upon those in the room to pick this up. And so a good third of this, well, not third, but a section of this report is also recommended agenda for research. And it's not what we're planning to do, it's what we're suggesting could be done. And so we're, as I said at the close to when I stopped talking, we need to figure out how to take this out widely. Because, again, I truly feel like in a very small group, I'm a world expert, because no one else is doing this. Makajani published one paper on his website and did nothing more with it, and I cite it every time so that his colleagues do not feel that I'm disregarding. But he did not devote himself to the work of bringing on board the radiation community. So another thing that happened in writing this report is that as a UN report, they brought the other UN agencies in to review it. And to do oral arguments essentially with me and my co-author.
What, at the UN this time?
No, online during the writing. They were, this is writing something like this is several stages. So agreeing, figuring out how to do the literature research, doing the literature research, combing through it all, then writing. We had to revise it 3 times because of this high-level review that we had to go through. So in that, we had arguments with some of the top people, but I don't feel that we changed their minds. So I do feel that it's going to have to be a generational project. And that is part of why I like changing the name of my organization to Generational Radiation Impact, because we need the younger people who didn't ever have the boot of the Manhattan Project on their head, right? We have a whole decades of whether you can even talk about these things, how you talk about them, how you research them. whether it was secret or not secret, whether you had access to the data or you didn't, all that stuff is now the grandparents and the great-grandparents of the generations who are now coming up. So my big focus is getting to those people. And NGOs are kind of like falling by the wayside on my priority structure, because it's really about trying to get into the educational systems and bringing biology back to the table, because it's been left to the physicists, and they didn't get it right.
Left to the what?
Physicists!
Oh, okay.
Mary, I still have a hard time understanding what your focus is on the explosion itself, radiation from the exposure itself, as opposed to all the fallout and all the rest of it.
Okay.
What is the point there? I can't quite grasp what you're trying to say.
Okay.
I can't understand.
The only reason to explain it, is because it happens that fact ties it directly to the weapon, which lets the people at the UN bring the weapon with them to the General Assembly, and my findings to the General Assembly out of the Security Council, because all of the nuclear stuff has been military. To bring it into humanitarian, they needed to show that the weapon itself, not the outcome of the weapon.
Okay.
And then coupled with that is the very rarely reported fact that the lifespan study was set up by the United States while it was occupying Japan with a single question. How much cancer do you get when you detonate a nuclear weapon? And that was the only question that the lifespan study was set up to answer. Now, it's been a source of great shame and derision that it wasn't actually set up to help the victims or describe all the outcomes from nuclear explosions or to describe the aftermath or any of that. It was a research question of what happens when you have that pulse of gamma and neutron. And that's it, because the epidemiological model is that what's the thing they all have in common? That's the one thing they all have in common. So if they then over life have dental x-rays or medical x-rays, or they had black rain fallout, all of that is considered the epidemiological noise, and the one signal is that moment of detonation. So the United States wanted to know how much cancer comes out of that. And that's the question. And so I can unequivocally tell the people at the UN, yep, that's it.
Well, the United States was using, the study itself was focused solely on the impact of detonation.
Yes. The survivors of the impact of detonation.
Survivors.
And the study started in 1950 so that all the immediate consequences would sift out. So it was defined as the 5-year survivorship, and then they had about 120,000 people to begin with, and a control community who did not have the detonation. Now it turns out everybody got some black rain, and that's been one of the big, huge contentions in the whole health consequences in Japan, is whether you consider that. And it's a mess, but I can tell you that for the lifespan study research question, the answer is no, you don't consider it.
I like your story where you share that with Rosalie Bertel, when you asked her how you look at the incidence of cancer from radiation in females. She said, go to this study. If the answer is in there already, right?
The only reason that I ever bring forward this terrible, terrible event of setting off a bomb and then studying the people. The bomb's the terrible event, and the study also is a terrible event. The only reason I bring it forward is there is no other big data set that includes males, females, and people of all ages. It's the only one that has a case-controlled data set that has emerged from it. The workers are important to study, but happily, atomic era is post-child labor, and they're primarily male. They're not only male, but the females who were in the administrative roles were not in the study. So you can't really compare questions, you can't ask questions about disproportionate harm in the DOE worker studies or any of the other big, now we have INWORKS, which is nuclear energy workers.
You can't ask.
You can't ask questions about women and children in a data set that don't have women and children.
Right.
So the lifespan is it. There
Yeah.
isn't another one. And so, again, it's a hardship when somebody asks me, well, where's the other data sets? Well, there aren't. But now we have this. And this is at least confirmatory that the findings continue to reflect that males and females are different.
Mary, I'm wondering about, and you're talking about the ambassadors and how good it was that there are other people there. I mean, the international community, is there better, what can I say, understanding of what's going on? It seems like in America, a lot of people hardly even understand what radiation does and why it matters. How about Europe or Africa? I don't know.
You know, I need to share something first before I answer that question. I was invited to speak to the floor of the treaty conference, which is not the same thing as the floor of the General Assembly, but it's the nations that are gathered there having their negotiations. And I was given the opportunity, if I wanted it, to speak to them, not just the side session where I was a speaker. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it because of what is happening in our nation. And I could not stand up before the nations of the world subset that was there and try to say anything. I was mute. I couldn't do it. So, yes, there is a difference to being from the United States and not being from the United States on every parameter that you could measure anything on. And I've experienced this every time I've gone to the UN starting in 1998. So, yes, there is a difference. We are very insulated, we are very privileged, we think we know everything. Stopping and listening and learning from anyone else is rare. And the impacted communities are finding more traction in non-US arenas, and that's always been the case, which is why they're at the UN seeking help. And it was that was partially what brought us to this treaty, is that so many communities have been impacted. But specifically radiation, you know, it's a rare bird. You know, how many people actually know about specific types of plastics or specific types of organochlorines or specific, you know, I mean, it's like an unfair question in a way. Does the average person understand radiation more? I think they have a better chance of it in a nation that didn't try to confuse everybody about it, which is what's gone on here. But I don't find a higher level of literacy.
Or a commitment to working on nuclear issues?
Oh, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is based on the idea that every nation has a right to be nuclear free, which prior to this treaty, other nations did not have that right. They could not say no to a nuclear nation bringing their nuclear weapons in. They might negotiate terms, or they might try to say no, but the nation that stood up and said, we're nuclear free, had nuclear ships brought right into their harbor by the US and France and declared, no, you're not nuclear free. That was New Zealand in 1970, whatever the year was. I was in college, and they blew up the Rainbow Warrior that had just, by the way, helped the evacuation of Marshallese people who were sent to live on a heavily contaminated island by our government in order to study them. And the Greenpeace went and evacuated at least some of those people. And it was that boat that was blown up. Not with the people on it, but still, it was a symbolic act. So we were in a state in the 70s where you did not have the right to be nuclear free as a nation. And now, with the TPNW, every nation that doesn't want to have them, and believe there are many who understand that nuclear weapons make us less safe, less secure. And they are standing together now under the TPNW saying, we are nuclear free, the future is nuclear free, we want you to join us. The treaty does not have any provisions for taking nuclear weapons away from the nuclear weapon states at all. It is an invitation. And it's an invitation to graduate, and it has the IAEA, the team that goes in and does inspections in possible nuclear proliferation areas, to administer an accountable and verifiable disarmament process, denuclearization process. And so, yeah, there's a lot of countries in the world who believe firmly that the transition is not going to come from the nuclear states. It's going to come by the nuclear states being ready to join them. They've been asked under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to wait till the nuclear weapon states would disarm. And instead, they got together and said, we have a feast at our table, come join us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good.